Hi, my name is Emma, and for as long as I can remember, my family has called me the charity case. 7 years. 7 years of whispered insults at family gatherings, of jokes meant to sting, and of being made to feel like a failure in my own home. It started when I was fresh out of college. I didn't have a fancy degree or a high-paying job lined up. I had loans, medical bills from a childhood illness, and a part-time job that barely covered rent. I was trying to survive, but apparently surviving wasn't enough. Every time I came home for holidays, I felt like I was walking into a battlefield. My cousins would snicker at the thrift stores I shopped at, the hand-me-downs I wore, even the homemade bread I brought because I liked baking. My siblings would laugh at me in front of their friends. "Oh, Emma, she's the charity case. Always broke, always giving herself away." At first, I tried to laugh along to pretend it didn't hurt, but it did. It hurt like 1,000 tiny cuts that never quite healed. What they didn't see was the work I was quietly doing to build my life. I volunteered at the local youth center, stayed late to help kids with homework, organized drives for the homeless, and even saved up to start small projects in the community. I wasn't rich in money, but I was rich in effort, in intention, in heart. That mattered to me, it just didn't matter to them. And then there was Grandma Rose. Everyone in the family always assumed she was just another bystander. A gentle old lady who would smile politely while we fought. But she noticed me in ways others didn't. She would sit beside me at gatherings, pat my hand, and whisper encouragement, though no one else could see it. I didn't realize it at the time, but she was quietly watching my life, keeping track of my choices, my struggles, my quiet victories. I had learned to accept their judgment, to swallow it like medicine. I learned to hide my hurt behind smiles and polite laughter. I got used to being the butt of jokes, the charity case, the girl who never seemed to have enough and somehow didn't deserve respect. But inside, I was determined. I knew that the way I lived my life, kindly, honestly, quietly, was something they would never understand, and that was okay. Even though I felt isolated from them, I wasn't alone. I had friends who saw my heart, colleagues who respected my work, and children who smiled when I walked into the room at the youth center. Their small gestures of gratitude became my lifeline. And yet, every family gathering reminded me that I had to endure. I had to survive their scorn, their mocking whispers, their cruel little jokes. Little did I know that those 7 years of ridicule were quietly setting the stage for a moment I would never forget. A moment that would turn everything upside down. I didn't realize that Grandma Rose had been watching, planning, and preparing, and that her love for me would become the catalyst for a reckoning my family could never anticipate. And honestly, at that point, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was just trying to get through another holiday dinner without crying. But sometimes, life has a way of turning quiet patience into powerful justice, and little acts of kindness into the loudest statement of all. And that's exactly what was about to happen in my life. The betrayal started as it always did at a holiday gathering. This time it was Thanksgiving, a day that was supposed to be about gratitude and family. But for me, it had become another reminder of my place in their eyes. The charity case, the girl who could never measure up. I had tried to brace myself, tried to tell myself that I could endure one more meal with fake smiles and veiled insults, but nothing prepared me for how cruel they could be when they thought I was defenseless. From the moment I walked in, the whispers began. "Look at Emma, still working at that nonprofit," my cousin whispered to my aunt, loud enough for me to hear. "Always giving herself away, never getting anywhere." My siblings smirked, elbowing each other. Their friends laughed, the sound sharp and cutting, like ice scraping across glass. I felt my stomach knot. I forced a polite smile, said hello, hung my coat, and tried to find my place at the table. Then it escalated. My cousin started pointing out all the things I had supposedly failed at. My apartment, still modest, was mocked as if I were living in a cardboard box. Oh, my thrift store outfits were described as quaint in the cruelest tone possible. Even my volunteer work, which I had poured my heart into, was ridiculed. "She's the charity case," one of them whispered with a laugh, helping everyone else but herself. I tried to keep my head down, to focus on the pumpkin pie in front of me, but the words stung like fire. And then there was the final blow, Grandma Rose. Or rather, the way everyone assumed she would remain silent, as she usually did. They expected her to stay neutral, to let me take the brunt of the humiliation. And for a moment, she smiled politely at me, nodded once or twice, but didn't intervene. It felt like betrayal, too. Like even the one person who might have understood me was letting them win. My chest tightened and I wanted to run to escape the laughter and judgment that filled the room. After the meal, while others drifted off to watch football or gossip in corners, I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring out the window at the cold November night. The wind was harsh, biting at my face, but it felt good. At least something outside could be honest and unrelenting. I thought about my life, about how I had worked tirelessly to do good, to help others, to be better than what my family seemed to value. And yet, in their eyes, none of it mattered. Not my sacrifices, not my kindness, not my patience. Then, quietly, Grandma Rose appeared behind me. "Emma," she said softly, placing her hand on my shoulder. It was gentle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but it anchored me in ways I hadn't expected. "They don't see you the way I do, but that doesn't matter. You have your own life, your own heart, and that is more powerful than their words." I nodded, feeling tears prick my eyes. She didn't need to say more. Her words were a lifeline in a sea of ridicule, a reminder that I was not alone, that someone truly understood me. I left the house that night feeling a mixture of anger, hurt, and a strange resolve. The label they gave me, the charity case, would stay with them, not with me. I would endure. I would survive. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to show them that their judgment couldn't define me. For now, though, I held on to Grandma's quiet encouragement, letting it simmer inside me, planting seeds of patience and strength that I didn't yet know would grow into something unstoppable. That Thanksgiving, what I thought was betrayal, had planted the first spark of a reckoning, one that would come much later, but in a way my family would never forget. After that Thanksgiving, I didn't want to go home again for a long time. My family's words had cut deeper than I realized, and the echoes of their laughter haunted me for days. I kept replaying the conversations, the whispers, the way they looked at me like I was some kind of disappointment, a failure in their eyes. I couldn't understand it. I worked hard, I lived honestly, I cared for others, yet in their eyes, I was nothing. The charity case label wasn't just a joke hit, was their way of defining me, of keeping me small. So, I turned inward. I buried myself in my work at the nonprofit, immersing myself in helping others. The youth center where I volunteered became my sanctuary. Kids didn't care if I wore thrifted clothes or lived paycheck to paycheck. They only cared if I showed up for them. And I did, every single day. I taught homework, organized community events, and stayed late to listen to their problems. Their gratitude and trust were a balm to my wounded pride. In their smiles, I found validation I wasn't getting at home. I also focused on my career. My job at a small nonprofit wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a sense of purpose. I organized local drives, helped families in need, and slowly began to make a name for myself in the community. People respected me, valued my dedication, and sometimes, when I least expected it, they thanked me in ways that warmed my heart. Those moments reminded me that my family's ridicule didn't define me. Their judgment couldn't touch the life I was building for myself. Still, the wounds were fresh. Every time I received a phone call from my mother or a text from a sibling, I braced myself for the inevitable criticism. When are you going to get a real job? Why do you waste your time helping others when you can help yourself? Stop being so dramatic, Emma. Each message felt like salt on an open wound. I started avoiding family events, claiming I was busy, making excuses. In truth, I just didn't want to face the shame of being mocked again. During those months, I realized something important. My family's opinions didn't matter. My self-worth wasn't tied to their approval. I began keeping a journal, recording my successes, small victories, moments of kindness, and times when I made a real difference. Slowly, I started measuring myself not by their judgment, but by the impact I had on the people around me. And the more I focused on that, the stronger I felt. The ridicule no longer pierced me like it once had. Yet, I couldn't shake the anger entirely. I felt a quiet fire smoldering inside me, a desire for acknowledgement. For the day my family would realize their cruelty didn't define me. I didn't know how that day would come, but I knew I had to wait. I had to keep living my life with integrity, even when it seemed like they would never notice. That patience, I realized, might be more powerful than any argument or confrontation. Most nights I would call Grandma Rose. She listened patiently as I vented, never judging, always encouraging. "Your time will come," she said softly one evening. "They don't see your worth now, but they will. Life has a way of balancing itself, Emma. Trust it." Her words planted a seed in me, a quiet hope that the years of being mocked, belittled, and overlooked weren't meaningless. That hope grew steadily, fueling my work, my dedication, and my determination. By the time the next family gathering rolled around, I had changed. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't small. I was quiet, patient, and building something bigger than their ridicule could ever touch. And while they still whispered, mocked, and judged, I had already begun to see that my life was mine, and their approval wasn't required. The fallout of that Thanksgiving wasn't just about hurt, it was about awakening. And I knew deep down that the stage for something greater, something I couldn't yet see, was quietly being set. Then the call came. Grandma Rose had taken a serious turn in her health, and my mother's voice trembled as she asked me to come home immediately. I hesitated, knowing what awaited me. The same family dynamics, the same whispered judgments, the same label of the charity case waiting to pierce my heart. But Grandma Rose was different. She had always been the one person in my family who seemed to understand me, quietly supporting me when no one else would. So I packed my bags and drove back home, heart heavy but determined to be present for her. The moment I walked through the front door, I felt the tension, the silent calculations, the barely concealed contempt. My siblings' eyes flicked over me, measuring me like a trophy they could mock. My cousins smiled too widely, the kind of smile that masks cruelty. Even distant relatives seemed to nod knowingly, as if to say, "Yes, she's still the charity case." I forced a polite smile, but inside I was seething. I had learned to endure over the years, but this time I felt something new, a quiet, simmering resolve. The first days were unbearable. Every family interaction seemed designed to highlight my so-called failures. They commented on my small apartment, my modest wardrobe, my frugal lifestyle. Every mention of my nonprofit work was met with sarcasm. "Still saving the world, huh, Emma?" My cousin laughed. "Maybe you should save your own bank account first." The words cut deep, but unlike before, I didn't react immediately. I listened, observed, and stored every word, every gesture, knowing that my strength lay in patience, not retaliation. Grandma Rose, though frail, seemed to sense my inner turmoil. She would catch my eye and offer a small, encouraging smile, as if to remind me that she saw more than my family ever could. One evening, she called me into her room. "Emma," she said softly, her frail hand brushing my cheek. "You've always carried yourself with more dignity than anyone else in this house. They don't understand you, but I do. And that will matter more than you know." Her voice, weak but unwavering, was a lifeline. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope ignite inside me. Yet the breaking point came unexpectedly. During dinner one night, my siblings began arguing over Grandma's possessions. Voices rising, accusations flying. They berated each other, revealing secrets and petty grievances. But the underlying theme was greed. And in the middle of it all, I remained silent, watching. For years, I had been the target of their scorn. Now, I was a silent observer of their unraveling. I realized with a strange sense of satisfaction that their arrogance and selfishness would soon lead them to consequences they couldn't predict. I spent the nights sitting by Grandma Rose's bedside, listening to her stories, memories from my childhood I had long forgotten. She spoke not of wealth, not of family disputes, but of kindness, patience, and integrity. She reminded me of the difference between living for appearances and living for values. I absorbed every word, realizing that what my family mocked in Mitha, quiet dedication. The charity, the patience, was my real strength. Their judgment couldn't touch it. By the time I left her room that evening, I understood something crucial. My family's cruelty had unintentionally prepared me for a reckoning. A moment when I would be seen for who I truly was. And though Grandma Rose's illness was heartbreaking, it had revealed the cracks in my family's veneer, showing their true colors. For the first time in years, I felt a strange mix of grief, determination, and anticipation. I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was waiting. Waiting for the moment when patience, integrity, and quiet resilience would have their day. And I had a feeling deep down that the universe and Grandma Rose were aligning in my favor. The days after that breaking point were a strange mixture of grief, observation, and cautious hope. Grandma Rose's condition remained fragile, but her mind was as sharp as ever. And I found myself spending nearly every moment at her side. It was during these quiet hours that I began to notice subtle, patterned small glances she exchanged with me. The way she smiled at my words, the way she lingered when others walked by. It wasn't just affection. It felt deliberate, purposeful. I began to suspect she had a plan that would soon turn everything upside down. My family, oblivious as ever, continued their petty battles. Siblings argued over trivial things, cousins whispered behind hands, and distant relatives leaned into every opportunity to display judgment. "Emma," one cousin said with a laugh, "why didn't you get a real job instead of playing with those kids?" Another chimed in, "Do you ever think about yourself, or is it all just saving other people?" I smiled politely, nodding, but internally I refused to rise to the bait. I had learned that the loudest voices rarely carried the truth. And then I noticed it. The subtle way Grandma Rose seemed to guide interactions. She would steer conversations toward values, gently questioning my relatives about their plans for the future, about how they treated others. She didn't scold them or argue, she simply planted seeds, allowed them to expose their greed and vanity. It was brilliant, silent, and powerful. I began to realize that Grandma had been watching my family for years, seeing their flaws as clearly as I had. And she wasn't just observing, she was orchestrating a moment that would expose them completely. I couldn't help but feel a surge of anticipation. After years of being ridiculed, ignored, and dismissed, I sensed that the universe was quietly preparing to tip the scales in my favor. Grandma Rose never said a word about the will. But there were hints, an affectionate glance, a subtle squeeze of my hand. A story about how patience and kindness were often the true measures of a person. Each moment felt like a piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. Even as I watched, I reflected on my own journey. For years, I had endured ridicule, hiding my hurt behind quiet work and volunteer efforts. I had learned to survive criticism, to measure myself by the people I helped, not by the people who mocked me. And now, I realized that patience was becoming its own form of power. My life of quiet integrity, the very thing my family had mocked, had been preparing me for this moment, a moment I didn't yet fully see, but could feel approaching. The more I observed my relatives, the more apparent their flaws became. Their greed was like an open wound, and their entitlement made them blind to everything else. Every whispered insult, every petty fight, every glance of superiority, they were exposing themselves in ways I had only imagined in my quietest thoughts. And I realized that Grandma Rose had been giving them time, letting their arrogance grow, all while she quietly built a foundation for justice. At night, I would sit by Grandma's side, holding her hand, talking about the world outside and the children I was helping. She would smile, sometimes nodding as though she already knew the outcome of the drama unfolding in the house. And I began to understand this wasn't just about inheritance or money or recognition. This was about integrity, patience, and the quiet triumph of living well despite ridicule. Grandma had shown me that real power isn't loud, it's subtle, deliberate, and often invisible until the perfect moment arrives. By the end of that week, I knew one thing for certain. My family had underestimated me. They had underestimated the quiet life I had built, the resilience I had nurtured, and the guidance Grandma Rose had given me. Something was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't be angry or vengeful, it would be undeniable. And I finally was ready to witness it. As the days passed, the tension in Grandma Rose's house became unbearable. My family's greed, which had always been simmering under polite conversation, was now boiling over into outright hostility. Siblings argued loudly over meaningless possessions. Cousins whispered accusations and innuendos behind hands, and distant relatives all but flung judgment in my direction. Each argument seemed to expose a new layer of their entitlement and selfishness. And through it all, I remained calm, watching and taking mental notes. For the first time in years, I realized their arrogance was no longer a threat to MIT, was a spectacle. I spent the mornings at the local youth center maintaining the life I had built outside their world. There, I reminded myself that the life I lived was meaningful, and that recognition would eventually come from the right sources. I couldn't control my family, but I could control my own actions, and that control became a source of strength. Every text from my mother complaining about my choices, every passive-aggressive comment from a cousin, every mocking look, all of it bounced off me. I had learned that patience wasn't passive. It was armor. Meanwhile, Grandma Rose seemed to delight quietly in their unraveling. She never intervened outright, but subtle cues revealed her amusement. A knowing glance, a soft smile, a raised eyebrow as my family squabbled over who would get what. It was as if she were silently saying, "Watch closely. You'll see what matters most." And I did watch, taking mental snapshots of every selfish remark, every greedy gesture, and every instance of entitlement. My family was revealing themselves completely in ways even they hadn't realized. One evening, the escalation reached a peak. My siblings argued over who would inherit Grandma's jewelry. My uncle chimed in with accusations that my cousins had manipulated my grandmother before she became ill. Voices were raised, tempers flared, and in the chaos, I sat quietly, barely speaking, but observing everything. I realized that their obsession with wealth and appearances was blinding them to the truth. Character, kindness, and integrity's the very qualities I had cultivated, were far more important than any object they fought over. Even as the arguments intensified, I felt a strange sense of calm. My life of quiet effort and service was untouchable by their insults. I had already won in the ways that mattered. They couldn't tarnish my reputation in the community, the good I had done, or the people who respected me. I was untouchable in the truest sense, and Grandma Rose had made sure I understood it. At night, I would sit with her, talking about the children at the youth center, the local projects I was working on, and even my personal dreams. She would listen intently, sometimes offering advice in her quiet, deliberate way. And often she would pause, look at me with that familiar sparkle in her eyes, and whisper, "They don't see yet, but soon. Emma, soon they will understand." I began to grasp the depth of her plan, not to reward me for survival alone, but to reveal the hollowness of my family's greed. By the time a week had passed, the chaos in the house had reached a fever pitch. My relatives were exhausting themselves with bickering and scheming, while I stayed above it all, serene, almost invisible. Their own actions were doing the work of exposing them, proof of their pettiness, selfishness, and moral bankruptcy. And as I watched, I felt a growing sense of anticipation, excitement even. Their behavior was the perfect setup. The stage was ready. The moment of reckoning, orchestrated by Grandma Rose, was drawing near. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't the one being tested. I was a spectator, a witness to the consequences of greed and arrogance. And I knew deep down that, when the time came, Everything my family had mocked and belittled about me would be vindicated in the most undeniable way. Patience, kindness, and integrity had prepared me for this exact moment, and I was ready. The day finally arrived. Grandma Rose's health had stabilized just enough for her to hold the family together in one room for what she called something important. I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation, though I had learned to control my emotions. I wasn't there to argue, to fight, or to prove anything. I was there to witness, to see the quiet justice that had been patiently brewing for years finally reveal itself. The room was tense, suffocatingly so. My siblings whispered under their breath, counting the seconds, calculating who would get what. Cousins elbowed each other, smirking as though already imagining their future inheritance. And then there was me, sitting quietly, pretending to be calm, while inside, my pulse raced with a strange excitement. I could feel the invisible threads Grandma Rose had been weaving for years. And I was about to see the tapestry complete. Grandma cleared her throat, her frail hand holding the thick, official-looking envelope. She looked around the room, eyes twinkling with a sharpness that contradicted her frailty. "I have something important to read to all of you," she began, her voice steady. "It's about the future of this family and about the legacy I leave behind." There was a murmur of excitement, even greed, as my relatives leaned forward, eager to hear the results of what they assumed was a normal inheritance reading. And then she began. She read carefully, methodically, her words slicing through the room like a scalpel. The bulk of her estate, the house, the investments, the savings, was being left to me. She cited my integrity, patience, and dedication to others as reasons for her decision. My heart pounded, a mix of disbelief and vindication. My siblings froze, their faces shifting from smugness to shock, then horror. My cousins' whispers faltered, their confidence evaporating. I was the charity case, the girl they had mocked for 7 years, and now their assumptions lay shattered on the floor. She didn't stop there. Grandma revealed the second part of her plan, a charitable trust in my name, designed to help underprivileged families and children in the community. Every project I had ever dreamed of supporting would now have the resources to grow, to flourish. The irony was not lost on me. The same family who had laughed at my volunteer work, who had ridiculed my thrift and humility, was now witnessing the power of the very qualities they had mocked. The room was silent, heavy with disbelief. My siblings looked at each other, mouths open, unable to form words. My cousins' earlier smirks had completely disappeared, replaced by guilt and resentment. Some of them tried to argue, to question Grandma's decision, but she raised a finger, stopping them effortlessly. "This decision is final," she said firmly. "It reflects the values I believe are most important. And that, my dear children, is something you may never understand." I sat quietly, absorbing the moment. There was no need for gloating, no need for victory speeches. My triumph wasn't loud or flashy. It was undeniable and profound. Years of patience, kindness, and quiet endurance had led to this instant. The family who had defined me by their cruelty had been forced to confront the truth. Their values were hollow. And mine, though overlooked for years, had carried me to a place of respect, power, and honor. Grandma Rose smiled at me, a twinkle of mischief and pride in her eyes. I understood, finally, the full extent of her plan. It had never been about money alone. It had been about revealing character, exposing greed, and rewarding integrity. And in that moment, I realized the most satisfying revenge isn't anger or malice-sized patience, grace, and living well in the face of those who doubted you. I had been the charity case for 7 years. Now I was the undeniable proof that patience, kindness, and integrity always prevail. And my family would never forget it. The days after Grandma Rose read her will were surreal. My family was still reeling from the shock, some angry, some ashamed, and some quietly seething. But for me, there was a strange sense of calm I had never felt before. The ridicule, the whispers, the cruel jokes, they no longer had power over me. I had endured, I had persisted, and now, in a way that was quiet yet undeniable, I had emerged victorious. Not through confrontation, not through anger, But through patience, integrity, then the simple act of living a life true to my values, I took the time to grieve for Grandma Rose, who had passed peacefully a few weeks later. Her final act of love and wisdom had been to give me a gift far larger than material wealth. It was the affirmation of my life, my choices, and my character. Every letter, every story, every whispered word of encouragement from her stayed with me. I realized that her trust in me had been more powerful than the ridicule of my entire family. That trust had strengthened me in ways that no inheritance could fully measure. With the estate and the charitable trust, I began to expand the work I had been doing for years. The youth center, which had once been small and underfunded, grew into a thriving community space. Programs for education, mentorship, and family support flourished under my guidance. I finally had the resources to turn the dreams I had quietly nurtured for years into reality. And the most beautiful part, I did it not for recognition, but because it was meaningful. I realized that the satisfaction of helping others was the truest reward of all. My family, meanwhile, had to confront themselves. Some of them avoided me, embarrassed by their own behavior. Others tried to argue or criticize my choices. But the truth was clear. They had underestimated me, mocked me, and yet, here I was, stronger, respected, and more capable than any of them had ever been. Their anger and envy didn't touch me. I had already won in the ways that truly mattered. I had integrity, patience, and a life of purpose. No amount of judgment or ridicule could take that away. I spent time reflecting on those 7 years of being called the charity case. At the time, it had felt unbearable, as though my entire existence was defined by their cruelty. But looking back, I realized it had shaped me into someone resilient, compassionate, and deliberate. The hardships had taught me to observe quietly, to act thoughtfully, and to value my own worth above others' shallow opinions. Grandma Rose had known all along that patience, kindness, and quiet strength would eventually outshine arrogance and greed.